Hello again. I am going to call this part the Atheist Neighbor. A big part of my motive in reading books, thinking and talking, seeking conversations is the wish to be a good neighbor. Who is a good neighbor? A good neighbor, I think, is someone who doesn't antagonize you, someone who doesn't scare you, at least not intentionally, someone who doesn't stigmatize or pigeonhole you, among other things. So those are some of the good qualities of a good neighbor. I imagine a good neighbor wouldn't irritate you with their loud music at the wrong times of the day or night. And in general, he or she doesn't force their taste, their preferences, their beliefs into your awareness. At the same time, the good neighbor isn't excessively secretive. They probably won't go out of their way to hide their form of life, their taste, their preferences, their beliefs, their values. They won't go out of their way to hide those things from you, I think. So there must be a balance between showing oneself and keeping things to oneself. As a good neighbor, and in my relationship with you as a neighbor, I should find a balance between showing things to you, sharing things intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes I just let something be visible, be accessible. And on the other hand, hiding things, keeping things to myself, keeping some things for the privacy of, my own home, inside of my own home. A good neighbor knows that he or she is part of your ecology and will likely not insist on being invisible all the time. Just like how they won't insist on being visible all the time. They won't insist on being invisible all the time. Instead, they try to be a part of your ecology in a way that is responsible, conscientious, and self-aware. They also will be open to receiving feedback from you. I recorded my previous video titled On Atheism about 2 weeks ago, but I didn't upload it until last night. The reason for that delay was because I wasn't sure whether it would go against the balance of visibility and invisibility that a good neighbor should keep. I thought about a few of my religious friends and neighbors who watch my videos occasionally. I thought of Johnny Keane, Sam Rocha, Greg Sadler. I thought about Mary Margaret. And those are just the people I know. I know because they have openly shared their religious beliefs. And I thought of others, wondering what they would think. Whether they would feel hurt by my insistence that atheism must be understood on its own terms. I received very encouraging comments in response to the video, comments that demonstrated understanding and carefully. It showed that at least a few people carefully watched my video. I'll have to respond to some of them in future videos. Here, in this part, I'd like to go a few steps further towards neighborly visibility, to show where my concerns are coming from. Is my personal history important in my discussion of atheism? That's a fair point. Somebody might raise that point. It's irrelevant. Why you care about these topics. What is important is the argument itself. So you should keep yourself out of it. So in that sense, should I just offer impersonal arguments? Who cares about my personal history and the way that personal history is entangled with how I think about atheism and theism? Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, has popularized the scene from Ernst Lubitsch's film Ninochka, in a scene where the protagonist orders coffee without cream, but is instead offered coffee without milk. The protagonist in the scene, he's told by the waitress, "Sorry, we don't have cream, we're out of cream. Can I bring you instead coffee without milk?" The point that he is making, the point that Žižek is making, is about negativity and history. The history of even a cup of coffee and the things that are intentionally left out of it, that history is important. It's not enough for a coffee to be black coffee. That's an impersonal, ahistorical way of thinking about it. That simple object, that example. It's important to know what element was intentionally not added to it or has been removed from it. It's important to know that history of the decisions. If this example doesn't bring out the point, it's just coffee. Instead, think about another example. Think about two single men, unmarried, two single men. One of them has always been single, while the other one, the second man, the second individual, was once engaged, but then broke off his engagement due to a personal crisis, like Soren Kierkegaard. These two ways of being single are not the same because they are coming from two very different histories and two different decisions, backgrounds of decisions. Now, my atheism is similarly, it has a history. It is informed by my own response to something, to my own, to events in my own life. My atheism is a response to Islam. It's a coffee without Islam, not coffee without Christianity or Buddhism or any other religion. It's an atheism that I regard as a necessary component of my culture of origin, Iran. It's an atheism that I'd like to insist for that purpose, partly for that purpose. At least that's the history of that history is part of my interest in atheism. And the fact that I would defend atheism as a live option, as a possibility, as a legitimate possibility for our time. My country has suffered a lot from not permitting atheism, not giving voice to it, downplaying it, repressing it with the excuse of good manners. You shouldn't talk about those doubts, those disbeliefs, because it's impolite, it's bad manners, because our culture is a religious culture, so keep those things to yourself. By repressing it, it has repressed the necessity to seek common ground, that secular common ground, with not only atheists, but with other religious minorities. Let me use an example to visualize how I think about the misuse of religion, and particularly the misuse of Islam in Iranian culture and Iranian politics. Imagine being at a funeral and having to behave extra politely because the people at the funeral expect you to behave according to the norms, according to how one behaves at the funeral. So there are conventions of how you stand, how you behave yourself quietly, in a well-mannered way. It's a funeral, so certain things are expected. Then a person starts going around and stabbing people with a small knife. And everyone continues to be silent and well-behaved, despite the fact that they feel the sharp edge of this knife, the insertion of this knife in their body. They know that they should continue because they are in that place, they are at a funeral. They can't. Certain things are just not done. Doesn't matter what is happening. Just continue to behave yourself. This nasty person keeps going around and stabbing people, but everyone keeps quiet because we are all still at the funeral. And convention dictates that we shouldn't fight. We shouldn't fight back or shout or react in a way that is appropriate to someone who has just been stabbed. The evil person is taking advantage of convention because the convention hasn't yet accommodated to counter convention. It's a convention that hasn't developed enough to be immune of people who are taking advantage of it in that way. People don't recognize, they don't have a place for the type of person who is willing to act inappropriately at the funeral, sing, draw cartoons of the deceased, etc. The culture hasn't accommodated to atheism. Some of my own family members will perceive my atheistic expressions, which aren't very frequent, but they perceive my expressions of atheism as impoliteness. That is not because of their personal stupidity, although it is an expression of stupidity, but it is not their personal responsibility. It's a cultural blindness. It is a cultural blind spot that is shared. It's a common feature of members of a culture or subculture. The same kind of blindness that led to the hijacking of the 1979 revolution in Iran. They hijacked the revolution. In my view, they hijacked it in the same way that imaginary person is stabbing people at the funeral, taking advantage of good manners and that cultural blindness, the cultural blind spot. Now, I can imagine someone objecting. What you're complaining, somebody will respond to me. They would say, what I'm complaining about is politics, the political misuse of religion, not religion itself. So my personal view is contaminated because of politics. So let's go back to that example of the funeral. Working with that imagined funeral scenario, there are two weapons that that evil, nasty person was using, hurting people in the gathering. The obvious weapon and a concealed weapon, the hidden weapon. The obvious weapon is the knife. But the more powerful weapon, the hidden weapon, is the willful silence of the group, the collective submission to a convention, and the collective attitude that we are not supposed to challenge the convention, we are not supposed to react. That is how religion can be weaponized. And that is how we should be mindful of its possible weaponization. To neutralize it, at least to neutralize its misuse, to diffuse its misuse, we need counter-convention. We need to have at least the possibility of being impolite. This isn't the impoliteness of a stranger, a passerby with whom you exchange insults and then you never see each other again. It's the impoliteness of a neighbor who stays there next to you for a long time. And the impoliteness of a neighbor needs a little more charity and patience from us. So please keep these notes in mind, these notes about my personal history, if you decide to listen to my future discussions about atheism and religion. I'm very grateful to everyone who commented on the previous video. Thank you. And I will have to respond to them, to some of the points you raised. But let me end this video, with one additional note about being a neighbor. The word neighbor in Persian, in Farsi, is hamsaye. It consists of the prefix ham, meaning common, and saye, meaning shadow. So literally, hamsaye, or neighbor, is someone whom you share a shadow in common with that person. A neighbor is someone who has a common shadow with you, someone who shares a shadow with you in common. If we turn our attention to the ground, to what is underneath, we see how we are the same. So you can here think about the Jungian shadow, or you can think about our mortality. That's it. Thank you for your attention.